According to Reform UK's Nigel Farage, as he was testifying to US Congress just yesterday, it seems that I now live in
North Korea.
Which is remarkable, because I'm pretty sure that as the leader of an opposition party in North Korea, Nigel Farage himself would be communicating to the world only via whatever words were inscribed on his tombstone at this point, if he lived in North Korea. Instead, he has a TV show on GB News, an uncanny ability to get his face on TV screens across the country, and now in the United States as well, apparently. But Britain and the US and many European countries are certainly having, shall we say, an ongoing moment of reflection on the topic of free speech. And because it's become the weapon of choice for a number of culture warriors, that moment of reflection has elements of absurdity, of incredulity, and also some serious and very important bits as well. All of them getting confused with each other. So let's give a quick overview of the current context that Farage was talking about. The US has been prone, thanks particularly to JD Vance and Elon Musk, to lecturing the UK and Europe about protecting free speech, by which they seem mostly to mean not acting against them, the far right, over online disinformation. The fiction has been spreading that you easily and almost randomly get arrested in the UK for a tweet. Farage has specifically said if you tweet something the government doesn't like. Now, I don't imagine the government liked him saying that, on account of the fact that it's complete garbage, but a number of people seem inclined to believe it at face value, and yet Nigel Farage is still, the last time I looked, at liberty. Ben Shapiro was repeating on his show a couple of days ago for fiction that 30 people a day are being arrested in the UK for posting memes and opinions on social media. Well, as I've covered here before, that figure is not true. It's drawn from a number that describes all online harassment, including individuals being targeted with death threats and sexual harassment threats. Those people make up nearly, but not the entirety of that number. Which is why we don't get lots of names in the public domain on this, because the ones that are worth quoting are relatively rare. Amongst the small number of names we do hear about, what they did is often played down or misrepresented. So one of Farage's two examples that he gave was that of Lucy Connelly, who again I've talked about here before. She tweeted to encourage people who were at that point actually rioting, encouraging them to set fire to hotels that were housing people who were asylum seekers. She pled guilty to the charge of incitement. She spent 10 months in prison, having been sentenced to 30. Now, you can argue about whether that was a harsh sentence or not. That's a matter of opinion. That's a matter for the courts in practice. People often disagree with sentences from the courts. But the politically motivated made it into an issue, suggesting somehow it was done at the direction of the government, which is not how the judicial system works in the UK. From my point of view personally, I would have thought it overly harsh, but she appealed the sentence, she lost the appeal, so the judges clearly disagreed. That is not a good case for critics to lean on. Recent polling of the public has shown that only 35% of the public agree with me that it was too harsh a sentence. And even many of those who agree do not think what she did was admirable in any way, which I also agree with. Just 18% of the public think politicians like Farage are well advised to associate themselves with her. 51% saying they should keep well away. So for Farage to be using her as one of his two case studies as to why we've become like North Korea, it's a bit of a stretch, and that's my polite British way of putting it. However, two things can be true at once, and while a lot of the rhetoric about free speech is going into odd places, it is true to say that the current UK legislation has arrived at a place where occasionally very dumb things indeed are being done by law enforcement that really should not be happening. One of those was the other of the two cases being championed by Farage at his testimony at Congress this week, which is that the comedy writer and extremely active campaigner on trans issues, Graeme Linehan, was arrested at Heathrow for several tweets he'd posted sometime earlier while in the United States. Linehan is controversial at times, can be quite aggressive and uncompromising in his demeanour, and indeed it is worth noting that he is currently on trial right now for an entirely separate set of charges of harassment and criminal damage related to a trans activist and his dispute with them. I have no knowledge of that case, no opinion as to its likely findings, but he is occasionally controversial. But he tweeted a post on Twitter that said this: "If a trans-identified male is in a female-only space, he is committing a violent abusive act. Make a scene, call the cops, and if all else fails, punch him in the balls." This led the police, under the Public Order Act, to arrest him on the basis that it makes an offence from, quote, "a threat to punch someone from a protected group could be an offence." And you might add, to punch them in a protected place, one might hope. But most people look at that and say, it's kind of absurd. Clearly not what the law was really intended for. I'm reminded of my much younger days when I was attending a protest and a friend was arrested for obstruction because he was standing by the side of a road giving people leaflets or something, and the police didn't want him there. Now, in the court case that followed, which I attended, his lawyer challenged the police officer and asked why he didn't arrest anyone who stops to look in a shop window for similarly obstructing the pavement. And the police officer said, well, the police were able to exercise discretion in how the law was applied based on context. My client, he said, was stood next to a tree, wasn't blocking anything. Was this not an example where it would have been appropriate to exercise that discretion? And in that case, the magistrate agreed, and that was the end of it. Similarly here, I don't think anyone genuinely believed that Linehan was actually calling for violence, not in the way that Lucy Connelly clearly was specifically doing. So you end up with this nonsense outcome. And you should be able to acknowledge that whether you love or you loathe this person. Quite a lot of people have been making a lot of the fact that Linehan was arrested by 5 armed police officers, and that's become part of the telling of his story. Now, to be fair, that's just optics. Police in the UK don't generally carry weapons, it's true, but police on duty at airports where he was arrested, they do. So it's not that the police sent out the special armed police to deal with this ageing Irish comedy writer. But even with that caveat, 5 officers does seem like overkill, but he wasn't mishandled, he wasn't treated badly, so so what? The absurdity is that he was arrested in the first place. Following this arrest, the head of the Metropolitan Police called for the law to be changed or clarified to stop this sort of thing happening. He argued that the police were left in an impossible situation, having to enforce the law on online speech as it is written. He said, "I don't believe we should be policing toxic culture wars debates, and officers are currently in an impossible position." So the head of the police doesn't want this. Prime Minister Keir Starmer also, while declining to interfere in police operational matters, because then he would be exactly interfering in a way that he's not supposed to, and that Lucy Connelly's supporters suggest he was. Nevertheless, he said that he hoped police would, quote, "focus on the most serious issues." This was reinforcing what his Health Secretary, Wes Streeting, had said earlier that day, that ministers, quote, "want the police to focus on policing streets rather than tweets." So it's pretty clear that what's happening here is relatively new legislation, confusion as to edge cases, clarifications very much needed, some patently dumb things highlighting that need that provoke excited headlines. It's hardly the regime cracking down with an iron fist, as Farage falsely suggested, on things that the government doesn't like. I mean, North Korea. So one needs to send Nigel Farage to North Korea. He needs to see with his own eyes a bit more closely what he's talking about. And hopefully making that joke doesn't constitute hate speech. Unfortunately, the UK has its full quota of angry and obstreperous and occasionally even stupid people who will keep testing out these edge cases. So just today, an elected local councillor for the Liberal Democrats got suspended from his party for posting a cartoon of a girl aiming a gun with the words "shut the F up, turf" on it. He posted it, directing the message at a party member he disagreed with. Cue a bunch of people, including J.K. Rowling, jumping in, saying this was two-tier policing, because while Graeme Linehan had been arrested for his tweets, this guy, whose name was Ian Bristow, had not been. Well, how about we all agree that nobody should be getting arrested for stuff that is clearly not a genuine, actual threat of violence, while everybody can be criticised and held accountable for posting aggressive, mean stuff, because we should generally discourage it. I know. I grew up in the time of hippies, that's my excuse. What's going on here? Because it's almost as though the UK right now is doing a comedy sketch on the theme of free speech. Highly embarrassing to all involved. Clearly something needs to be done to make it stop. Lots of hilarious unintended consequences. But why is Nigel Farage therefore invited to speak at an allegedly grown-up part of the US government on the basis that the UK is experiencing a genuine free speech crisis? Because the allegation of denial of free speech is a standard weapon of the MAGA political movement, of which Farage's Reform UK is part. By free speech, what they mostly point at is the ability of themselves and their supporters to spread disinformation about immigration, about incidents of violence, about all sorts of things. The nature of free speech is that it has a long history of being used in exactly this sort of way, being held to be a crucial part of society by opposition parties who benefit the most from invoking it, and yet being viewed as more legalistic and tiresome by exactly the same politicians once they become the government. And sometimes it doesn't even take that long. So in the UK, we have had a genuine, more serious issue around free speech that has come from the government prescribing an organisation called Palestine Action. We are told, and I have no reason not to believe it, that this group is violent, the sort of group that should be counted as a domestic terrorist organisation. Fine, I trust they're correct on that. However, a lot of people support action against the attacks by Israel on Palestinian civilians in Gaza. They have been expressing their support for this group. In principle, the law prescribing domestic terrorist groups makes it illegal to be a member of one, but also illegal to publicly express support for one. Now, at some point, we need that lawyer putting his or her head up and saying, but the police should be using common sense discretion in that, right? Instead, we saw a lot of obviously harmless protesters, grannies, earnest early 20-something students, you name it, wearing T-shirts saying, I support Palestine Action. The smart thing to do would have been to leave them alone. Sure, you can read the legislation legalistically and say they're in breach, but there's no public interest in doing so. Instead, the police were in Jobsworth mode, and they arrested all of them, even though they didn't physically have enough space in the cells in London police stations to put them all. So this wasn't tweeting encouragement for refugees to be burned alive in hotels by rioters. This was people saying that they believed what's happening in Gaza is genocide. You can agree or disagree with that, but come on. Free speech on both sides, you know? And simply saying so by means of a T-shirt, that was enough to get them arrested. Indeed, one guy got arrested for holding this meme from Private Eye magazine, something that you can buy at any newsagent. Again, policing on autopilot. Utterly ridiculous. Now that should have gotten all of those free speech warriors absolutely furious. But no, because ultimately the people currently weaponising free speech don't care about free speech, the principle, in the slightest. Nigel Farage quoted Voltaire at his testimony. I defend to the death your right to say the things I disagree with. It's not how he behaves. Not a squeak from him or the far-right free speech warriors on this. Not a squeak even from the Free Speech Union, which has, however, posted content decrying Palestine activists seeking to deplatform Israelis. Nigel Farage's number 2 at Reform UK, Richard Tice, who was recently infusing at protesters outside the asylum hotels. He had a different view on the Palestine Action protesters. Quote, "Arrest and charge the lot. Jail them," he said. "Clearly not. I disagree with what you say, but defend your right to say it." This, of course, could also be applied to Nigel Farage's judgment that the place to go to sup at the well of free speech purity is Donald Trump's America. The place where students who protest what they think about Palestine, well, they get arrested and then deported. Where there is a constitutional protection of free speech, but now there's at least one branch of police, very well funded recently, at least some of whom have suggested that such protections are not available to all. Free speech for me, but not for thee, seems to be the post-Voltaire slogan. So it's not that none of this matters. We have a real problem with free speech, as we have a real problem with disinformation and governments imposing an ideological version of reality onto institutions. And actual free speech, where you have the freedom to speak genuine truth to power, is one of the things still worth fighting for. And I suggest will become even more so should Farage ever take control of the levers of power in the UK, as his mate Trump has in the US. The problem with free speech debate is that it only gets tested with edge cases. In the UK, you can't incite violence or seek to actively stir up racial hatred. So you get cases where someone goes really close to that line. And that gives you cases that genuine free speech supporters then have to defend, where the nature of what they're defending is something they really don't like or support at all. That's how you know you don't live in North Korea, Nigel. In this situation, I see you sitting in a privileged place in America, suggesting that the government there should be looking to take action against your own country. It may not exactly be treason. Doesn't seem very patriotic.